Namo Buddhaya. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the globe. Welcome to Dhamma USA's Sunday Dhamma Talk series. Today, we are thrilled to present our 98th talk in the series, and it promises to be an enlightening and thought provoking session. I'm your host. My name is Bhante Sumita, and it's my honor to guide you through today's event. Whether you are a regular attendee or joining us for the first time, we are delighted to have you here in this shared space of learning and reflection. Today's talk will focus on a topic that lies at the heart of Buddhist philosophy: views and Buddhist logic. To lead us on this journey, we are privileged to have with us Sāmaṇera Vaḍḍhā, a dedicated and insightful novice monk from Empty Cloud Monastery. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our esteemed speaker. Sāmaṇera Vaḍḍhā, also known as Venerable Vaḍḍhā, embarked on his monastic journey after studying anthropology at university and living in Argentina. Inspired by the teachings of the Buddha, he chose to leave behind the lay life and dedicate himself to the path of Dhamma. His primary focus is on studying and practicing in line with the early Buddhist texts, while also exploring insights from various later Buddhist traditions. Currently, he resides mainly at Empty Cloud Monastery in New Jersey, where I am also residing these days, a tranquil and spiritually enriching environment. And he also spends time in Italy, where he is involved in a forest monastery project. His diverse experiences and deep commitment to the Dhamma make him a valuable guide for our discussion today. As we delve into the topic, views and Buddhist logic, Sāmaṇera Vaḍḍhā will help us explore how views shape our understanding and experience of reality, and how Buddhist logic provides a framework for discerning the true nature of things. It's an opportunity to reflect on how we perceive the world and the impact of our views on our lives and spiritual journey. Before I hand over to Venerable Vada, I encourage you all to make the most of this session. Feel free to share your thoughts and questions in the chat. Our team will be monitoring your comments, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the talk to address some of your inquiries. Now, without further ado, let us welcome Sāmaṇera Vaḍḍhā to lead us through this fascinating exploration of views and Buddhist logic.
Thank you so much, Bhante Sumita. That was a very
Thank
too
you.
enthusiastic of an introduction for me. Very kind of you. Yes, so thank you everybody for joining us and for being interested in hearing the Dhamma. I'll do my best to try to represent the Buddha's teachings here. And today I wanted to talk about something that I think doesn't get a lot of attention in Buddhism these days, and that's what we call the undeclared points. In Pali, they're called the abhyakatavatu, or the abhyakata, things that are not declared. So I have a presentation here that I can go through a few things and try to indicate some of the subtleties and some of the core concepts that we're supposed to take from the Buddha's teaching on what he did and did not declare. But it's a very, very profound subject, so I won't be able to go into too much detail. I'll do my best to give you an introduction, and then hopefully you can explore this in your study and in your practice. I wanted to start by looking at this one sutta here. This is Anguttara Nikaya 4.77. And in this sutta, which many of you may know, the Buddha says that there are 4 things which are unthinkable or imponderable. So he says they should not be thought about, and anyone who tries to think about them will go mad or get frustrated. And so these are the scope of Buddhas, the scope of someone in jhana, the results of karma or kamma and vipaka, and speculation about the world. And so you may have heard about this. For example, usually we'll tell people if they're very stuck thinking about karma and what is the results of karma, what is not the results of karma, what karma did we do to get this result. The Buddha says that we shouldn't think about that, right? We should understand the principles of karma, but we shouldn't try to work out the details of it all the way, and that actually we will only go mad or get frustrated. And similarly for the scope of Buddhas, the knowledge and the mind of a Buddha, as well as the scope of someone who has attained jhana. But the 4th point here is specifically what I wanted to talk about today, and that's where the Buddha says that speculation about the world is also something we should not think about. And this particular teaching is something that occurs many, many times throughout the suttas, throughout the discourses and texts that have been passed down as teachings given by the Buddha. And so speculation about the world is something that maybe we don't feel that we're very interested in. Maybe we don't feel that we speculate about the world very often. But I think that when we look into this, you'll see that these are very common questions, and they're trying to point us to ways that we tend to relate to our experience that are actually detrimental to our Buddhist practice. And they have to do with what the Buddha called views, or ditthi, which are one of the fetters, one of the underlying tendencies, or also one of the asavas, the defilements that keep us shackled in this cycle of samsara. So I think it's worth looking at what did the Buddha mean when he talked about views and getting stuck to views, specifically speculation about the world and related topics. So there's a sutta here that I won't read the entirety of it, but I thought that I would go through the beginning of it just to give you a taste of what we're talking about. And then we can kind of analyze the subject in more detail. So this is called the Chula Malukya Sutta, and I'll just be reading briefly from Bhante Sujato's translation. So at one time, the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. Then, as Venerable Malukya Buddha was in private retreat, this thought came to his mind. There are several convictions that the Buddha has left undeclared. He has set them aside and refused to comment on them. For example, the cosmos is eternal or not eternal, or the cosmos is finite or infinite. The soul and the body are the same thing, or they are different things. After death, a Tathagata still exists, or no longer exists, or both still exists and no longer exists. Or after death, a Tathagata neither exists nor no longer exists. The Buddha does not explain these points to me. I do not endorse that and do not accept it. I'll go to him and ask him about this. If he gives me a straight answer on any of these points, I will lead the spiritual life under him. If he does not explain these points to me, I will reject the training and return to a lesser life. Okay, so just to pause here, what this monastic he's thinking is that the Buddha has refused to comment on these questions, which I've laid out here. These questions, you can see some of them here, and we'll go over them in more detail later. But for now, I'll move that away. And so what he's thinking, right, is I'm going to go to the Buddha and I'm going to force him to give me an answer. And if he does not give me an answer, I'm going to leave the monk's life. So he thinks the Buddha needs to answer him, right? And so then it says, in the late afternoon, Malukya Buddha came out of retreat and went to the Buddha. He bowed, sat down to one side, and told the Buddha of his thoughts. So he tells him this, what he's been thinking. And then he says, if the Buddha knows that the cosmos is eternal, please tell me. If you know that the cosmos is not eternal, tell me. If you don't know whether the cosmos is eternal or not, then it's straightforward to simply say, I neither know nor see. So then he goes through all of the different points, And so what he's doing here is he's actually being very disrespectful to the Buddha. He's saying, if you know the answer, you need to say it. And if you don't know it, you just need to admit that you don't know, right? So he's telling the Buddha, admit that you don't know the answer or tell me the truth. And he goes through all of the points, right? So if you don't know that the soul and the body are the same thing or the different things, then you need to say it or you need to tell me the answer. And then the Buddha responds, what, Malunkyaputta, did I ever say to you? Come, Malunkyaputta, lead the spiritual life under me, and I will declare these things to you. No, sir. Or did you ever say to me, sir, I will lead the spiritual life under the Buddha, and the Buddha will declare these things to me? No, sir. So it seems that I did not say to you, lead the spiritual life under me, and I will declare these things to you. And you never said to me, sir, I will lead the spiritual life under the Buddha, and the Buddha will declare these things to me. In that case, you silly man, who are you and what are you rejecting? Suppose someone were to say this, I will not lead the spiritual life under the Buddha until the Buddha declares to me that the cosmos is eternal or not eternal, etc., or that after death the Tathagata exists or does not exist, or both or neither. That would still remain undeclared by the Tathagata, and the Tathagata is the Buddha, for those of you who don't know. And meanwhile, that person would die. So here the Buddha is saying that no matter what, even if someone really were to think that they will not live the monk's life with the Buddha until he declares the answer, the Buddha is saying the person would sooner die than hear the answer, meaning that he would never declare it in their lifetime. He would never say one of these answers. And so then the Buddha gives a simile of a very famous simile. He says, suppose a man was struck by an arrow thickly smeared with poison. His friends and colleagues, relatives and kin would get a surgeon to treat him. But the man would say, I won't extract this arrow as long as I don't know whether the man who wounded me was an aristocrat, a Brahmin, a peasant, or a menial. I won't extract this arrow as long as I don't know following things about the man who wounded me, his name and clan, whether he's tall, short, or medium, whether his skin is black, brown, or tawny, and what village, town, or city he comes from. I won't extract this arrow as long as I don't know whether the bow that wounded me was straight or curved, etc. And so the simile here is saying, imagine that we're injured, and we say, no, I'm not going to be cured until I know all the information about who shot me, what the arrow is made of, what the bow is made of, where they're from, right? And so clearly that's not helpful to being cured from an arrow, right? And so the Buddha says this is the same, right? That someone who leads the spiritual life, who practices the Buddha's path to liberation, this is a path to remove suffering, like removing the arrow. And speculating about where the arrow is from and who made it and so forth, this is irrelevant to our actual practice, right? And so then the Buddha says, it's not true that if there were the view the cosmos is eternal, there would be the living of the spiritual life. When there is the view that the cosmos is eternal or that the cosmos is not eternal, there is rebirth, there is old age, there is death, and there is sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress. And it is the defeat of these things in this very life that I advocate. And I think I'll pause here and then we can move on. And so what this is saying is that it's not that the Buddha is agnostic or he's not going to say an answer. He actually says that if we had one of these opinions, then we would not be able to find freedom from suffering, right? He says that the defeat of these things, which means letting go of these views, all of these views, is the teaching of the Buddha. He advocates letting go of these views, right? And it's actually impossible to hold these views and find liberation. So at this point, I'll pull up a list, and you can see here the four main views at the top. These are the traditional list of 10. So this is Sasato Loko, Asasato Loko, Loko Antava, or Antava Loko, Anantava Loko. And then we have Tanjivang Tang Sarira, Anyang Jivang Anyang Sarira, or Hoti Tathagato Paramarana, Na Hoti Tathagato Paramarana, etc. So this is the Pali for the list of these 10 questions. And then below these four, I've given some other points which are also given. They're related to the undeclared points. So one is that dukkha is caused by ourself, or it's caused by another person, or it's caused by both, or it's caused by neither. And then we also have a very basic one, which is existence, which is like eternalism, or believing that we exist, or a thing truly exists, and non-existence or annihilationism, which believes that we will cease to exist, or things can cease to exist substantially, right? They can be annihilated. And so these are what the Buddha calls views, ditthi, and he does not declare them, right? We have a question on the screen. I'm not sure if I should answer the questions now or maybe after. Maybe after, I'll go through. Okay, so these traditional, this list of 10 views and then some other views. You may be familiar also with a similar structure from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the turning of the wheel of Dhamma. This is the Buddha's first sermon. And there he says that bhavatanha, craving for existence, and vibhavatanha, or craving for non-existence or annihilation, that these are both to be let go of, right? And then he also talks about, in other suttas, he talks about bhavaditti, the view of existence, and vibhavaditti, or the view of annihilation. And so all of these views are what we would call wrong views, or we would call them views that when we hold them, we get shackled in samsara, we get shackled into suffering and rebirth, right? But it might be frustrating. Actually, I've had many people, they ask these questions, even people very new to Buddhism, they naturally ask these questions, right? Even my parents have asked me these questions, similar questions, right? So even to this day, people are speculating, is the world eternal or is it not eternal, right? What this means is, does the world have a beginning and an end, or is it beginningless and endless, right? And the world here means the cosmos, like the whole universe, the kind of an idea of an objective universe. And the world is finite or infinite. Again, this is also something that's speculated or talked about today, right? We talk about the universe expanding, but it's also infinite, right? And there's kind of a confusion there. And so these views are still common. The third view, the soul is the same as the body or a different thing. This is one of the perennial questions of Western philosophy. This is what we call the mind-body problem. And in Western philosophy, this has basically been a topic since Plato or before Plato. And it still is a problem today, or we should say it's still a discussion going on today, right? Is the mind or our soul kind of like our agent, our person, our mind, is that the same as our body? And this would be the idea of physicalism or materialism. For example, that common view today is that the consciousness that we experience is actually just a byproduct of the brain. It's just a function of the body. And so then people think that when the body dies, the consciousness also dies, right? And other people, they might think, no, we have a soul and it's different from our body. And so when our body dies, our soul goes on and it's separate from the body, right? And so both of these views, the Buddha is rejecting. And then the most classic standard example of these undeclared points, the one that you'll see the most, is these four of the existence of the Buddha or the existence of an enlightened person after they pass away. Okay, so the view is, when the Buddha dies, does he still exist? Or when he dies, does he not exist anymore? Or when he dies, does he both exist and not exist? Or when the Buddha dies, does he neither exist nor not exist? So he doesn't exist, but he also doesn't not exist. And these four here, I think, are something that many Buddhist people also speculate about today, right? They'll say, oh, the Buddha still exists, or the Buddha doesn't exist, or maybe the Buddha is in a neither state, or maybe he both exists and doesn't exist. So still to this day, you'll hear people speculating, right? And one of the important lessons from this is you can learn to discern when you're getting caught up or stuck in speculation that the Buddha said we need to set aside, right? So even if you don't understand, why did the Buddha not say the answer? Maybe you're like the monk, Malunkyaputta, and you think, why didn't the Buddha just say the truth? One of these has to be correct, right? One of them has to be true. Which one is it? And so if you're like the monk, Malunkyaputta, then you might be frustrated and you might try to find an answer. But the Buddha said that really we need to set these questions aside, that actually we can't have none of these views can be true, as well as the other views on this list. And so we're going to explore that just a little bit more detail now. Here I'm listing briefly, there are other views that are given in the suttas that are related to these. These are views in the Brahmajala Sutta. So this is the very first sutta in the Digha Nikaya, and it lists 62 views or 62 approaches to views. And there you have the view of eternalism or partial eternalism, that the cosmos and the self are finite or infinite, and these we've already talked about. You also have random arising, that the self or the cosmos arise randomly by chance, and that is also mentioned in the undeclared points. For example, one of the undeclared points is suffering random? Does it arise randomly? And the Buddha says he doesn't say that. Then we have the self surviving after death. So this is related to the soul that exists after the body, different ideas of the soul. And then we have annihilationism, the idea that we are annihilated or we cease to exist at death or at some point in time. And then extinguishment in this life, or also nibbana in this life. Here it means extinguishment of suffering. So I'm not going to go through the Brahmajala Sutta here today because it's a very big topic, but I just wanted to show you that you can see some of the similarities in the Brahmajala Sutta views and the undeclared points, right? So the world being eternal, we see that here. Is the world eternal or not eternal? The world being finite or infinite, we also see that here. And we see views about the soul and annihilation and so forth, right? And then flip-flopping is a translation for agnosticism or skepticism, okay? And we will talk about that as well. That is also important for understanding these views. So I'm going to go and give some examples of these in real time. So here is a sutta where the Buddha gives an example of one of these views. Mendicants, you might say, what are old age and death, and who do they belong to? Or you might say, old age and death are one thing, who they belong to is another. But both of these mean the same thing, only the phrasing differs. So if we say, who is getting old and sick, or who dies, who is getting old? Or is old age one thing and the person who gets old another thing? I'm hearing that there might be something wrong with the audio. Is it working okay?
Yeah, I think I heard some background. Can you speak now?
Yes, hello, Bhante. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, it doesn't look good to me.
Okay.
I hear some.
Do you hear maybe some vacuuming? I hear some vacuuming here in the monastery.
Not really. I think it is. I hope the others. If the others also have the same issue, then there is some issue. If not, it should be fine.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption. Okay. Is everyone finding it okay?
Here, see if it works.
You don't feel that, right? Yeah, you probably don't.
No, to me, I don't have any issues.
Yeah, I think there is an issue with the audio.
Okay. Is it any better now? I just tried muting and unmuting.
Okay, so this is some people already. No, it's connection issue. It's a little bit of a disturbance in the background. Yeah, so my voice is fine. Ayavada's transmission is coming off with noise.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for the feedback, everyone.
Yeah.
This is a very important topic, so we don't want to. No. Okay.
Do you have any ideas, Bante, for?
Would you mind maybe vacuum is causing interference?
Not sure.
Hmm.
When I speak, can you hear me okay, or is it
Uh,
just
I,
background noise?
yeah, whenever you speak, we hear that vibrating kind of noise.
Okay. I wonder if it could also be the fan.
I don't think it is that. if you can maybe logging out and
Okay.
logging in, yeah, will take some time. Uh, all right. So, dear friends, please bear with us. We will come back as soon as possible. It's a very important topic, and Ayurveda was actually Sāmaṇera Vaḍḍhā was doing a great job, and hopefully it should be fine. And we hope it actually comes better. Yeah, he's back here, and would you mind? Yeah, how is it?
Hello, can you hear me now? Is it any
Oh,
better
yeah,
now?
now it looks better.
Okay, that's good.
Wonderful. Okay, so do you want to use the
Yes,
slideshow?
let me add that here.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and yeah, so we are clear now. Thank you.
Okay, apologies for that. Okay, so let's go to our example. And if you hear any problems again, I'll try logging out.
Now, yeah, that worked.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Bante. So here's our example. As I was saying, in case you maybe missed it, that the Buddha says we might say old age and death are one thing, and the person who experiences them are another. Or we might ask, like, who experiences old age, right? Who gets sick? This is also a common question. You might hear, who gets reborn, right? If there's no self, who gets reborn? Or who gets sick and who gets old? And this is what the Buddha says to that. He says, if you have the view that the soul and the body are the same thing, there is no living of the spiritual life. If you have the view that the soul and the body are different things, there is no living of the spiritual life. Avoiding these two extremes, the realized one teaches by the middle way, and the middle way is dependent origination. So this is interesting, right? Here we have two extremes. You might be familiar every day here at the monastery, we chant what's called the Kachanagota Sutta, and it talks about the two extremes between existence and non-existence, right? And here the Buddha is giving another two extremes, which are the soul and the body are one thing, they're the same thing, and the soul and the body are separate things. And so here you get to see that the Buddha, it's not that one of them is correct, it's that both of them are wrong, right? And neither of them can be true. That's the problem with this question. And that's why he doesn't give an answer. So I'll give an example of this so you can understand a little bit the kind of situation. It's like if someone were to ask, is the current king of France bald? Right? And if we say no, the current king of France is not bald, or we say yes, the current king of France is bald, actually there is no current king of France. France doesn't have a king, right? So both of those are wrong, right? It's not that the king of France is bald, and it's not that the king of France is not bald. It's that actually we're talking about something that isn't really, it doesn't really exist, right? There is no king of France. And so that's not exactly how these points work, but you can get a sense of, oh, okay, so the question is wrong. It's framed wrong, right? And we'll get into that as well, but I'll give some more examples. So here's another example. Well, Mr. Gautama, are pleasure and pain made by oneself? Not so, Timbraku, said the Buddha. Then are pleasure and pain made by another, by someone else? Not so, Timbaruka, said the Buddha. Well, are pleasure and pain made by both oneself and another? Not so, Timbaruka, said the Buddha. Then do pleasure and pain arise by chance, not made by oneself or another? Not so, Timbaruka, said the Buddha. Well, is there no such thing as pleasure and pain? It's not that there's no such thing as pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain are real. Right? So here, again, someone is very confused, right? Because these are really the only four options. Either it's made by ourselves, it's made by somebody else, it's made by a combination of both, or it's made by neither. There's no other option, right? It can't be made. These are the four options that exist. And so that's why Timbaruka is very confused, because the Buddha says no, 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 no to each, right? And he also says that, well, pleasure and pain are real. So it's not that they don't exist, right? So I gave the example of the king of France, right? The king of France doesn't exist, but in this case, pleasure and pain do exist. So what's going on, right? Why is the Buddha not giving the answer? And the middle way he teaches is also dependent origination here. Here's just another brief example from the Brahmajala Sutta. One of the views is that which is called the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, and the body, transient and perishable. But that which is called mind or sentience or consciousness, that self is permanent, everlasting, eternal, imperishable, remaining the same for all eternity. And here, this is another view of what's called partial eternality, right? So some things are impermanent, but other things are permanent. So again, this might be the idea of the body is impermanent, but maybe our mind is permanent, right? Or maybe our mind is the same as our body, and both are impermanent. So these are different views that people can have, and for the Buddha, these are not correct. So now I want to talk a little bit about the means of knowing and why these views are this way. So when the Buddha doesn't declare these views, he says a few things, and we've seen this. One is that holding these views is not relevant, right? If we're trying to remove suffering, like removing an arrow, it's not relevant who shot the arrow or what the arrow is made of. What matters is getting rid of the suffering, right? So for the Buddhist path, for our practice, it's not important whether the soul is the same thing as the body, or whether the Buddha exists or does not exist, or both or neither after death, or whether the world is eternal or not eternal. None of these questions matter, and we shouldn't waste our time thinking about them. So that's one of the reasons, right? Not useful. But then we also saw that it's not that it's just not useful, it's also that it actually can't be true, right? If it were true, it would be a problem. And if we held one of these views, we wouldn't be able to remove suffering. So it's not just that it's useless, but it's also that it's actually impossible to hold it and have benefit in our practice, or I should say ultimate benefit. So this is what's called a view, right? As I mentioned, and this is the tangle of views, as the Buddha calls it, or the jungle and thicket of views, the thicket of opinions and views, speculative views. So this is a fetter. And then the fourth reason, which we'll talk about now in more detail, is that the Buddha says, and his disciples say, that these questions, they miss the scope of language and the scope of knowledge, the scope of the aggregates, the scope of the senses, the scope of rebirth and samsara, or what we can call the scope of knowing, the scope of experience, right? So these questions, they go beyond what we actually experience. They go beyond what we can know. So we have certain ways of coming to know things, and a view, a ditthi, arises when we extrapolate our experience to form an opinion that is actually not based off of that experience, right? Or not grounded. So an example of this is, for example, maybe we think and we reflect, okay, I seem to have a mind. My mind seems to be different from my body. And I know that my body will pass away. So then maybe my mind must be eternal. My mind must be separate from my body, and it must exist independently of my body as something completely separate, a separate substance from my body, right? And that's something that philosophers and thinkers in the time of the Buddha and in Europe and in many cultures, they've thought about this, right? But that goes, what we would say, beyond the scope of experience, right? We don't experience a mind that is actually a separate substance which is eternal. We don't experience that. All we experience is, we do experience mental experiences, mental phenomena, mental contact, and we do have the experience of a mind, but we can't actually separate that mind and say, this is one thing and the body is another thing, right? But also our mind is not the same as our body. They are different. So, or I should say, they're not the same, but they're also not different. That would be a better way of saying it. So it's not that they're completely separate, right? But it's also not that they're the same. And so for the Buddha, what we want to do is we want to reflect on the way that our experience arises, the way that we know things, and the kind of relationships between those things, which we call dependent arising. But we don't try to separate things out and form essences or substances. Right? Another example of this would be the idea of a self, right? So maybe we experience thoughts and we experience sights and sounds and smells, and then we think, oh, myself is experiencing these things. But we don't actually know a self, which is behind everything, experiencing it all, right? All we know is that these experiences arise and cease due to certain causes and conditions. And so to speculate that a self is experiencing everything, that would be a view, because it would be extrapolating based off what we experience and developing an opinion outside of it. And there are many, many opinions and views that people can hold, and we've gone through some of them. So some of them, for example, would be that the world is eternal, right? If the world is eternal, well, how would we know that? In order to know that something is eternal, we would have to experience it never end and never begin. But how could we experience the world never ending, right? We would also have to be eternal. And then we would have to go beyond the eternal time and see outside of time that something was beginningless. Right? This starts to get a little bit difficult to think about, but we can't step outside of time and see something eternal. It's not possible. It's simply impossible because of how experience works, right? Time is part of our experience. We can't step outside of it and observe it. So what this means is that we can actually never say if something is eternal. And because we can't say something is eternal, we can't say it's not eternal either, because we can't prove that it's not eternal, and we can't prove that it is eternal. And if we held either of these views, we would actually be just holding an opinion which was grasping at our experience in a way that misunderstands how experience works. So both of these views are wrong. It's not that it's eternal, and it's not that it's not eternal. It's that the world arises due to causes and conditions. And when those causes and conditions are no longer there, then the experience of the world does not arise. Right? So we can talk about our experience of the world, but we can't talk about the world out there existing eternally or not eternally, because that's just beyond the scope of how our world of experience works. So this is it gets, can be difficult to think about, but I just want to point to this. And so what this boils down to is what we call contact or sense experience, or the dependent arising, the conditional appearance of our experience. And one way that the Buddha breaks this down for forming views is in this list here: Dipta, Sutta, Mutta, Viññāta, and also sometimes Silapada. I don't have time to go through all of it in extreme detail, but Dipta are things that we see, Sutta are things that we hear, and so on. And what this essentially means is that we experience different things. We may see a person, or hear a teaching, or hear a sound, or see a sight, and other things through our senses, or through our thinking faculty in our mind, or even in our meditation, or we may practice certain rituals and precepts. And based off those, we might develop viewpoints, right? So like I gave an example of this. Maybe we hear a teaching about an immortal self, and maybe we think, oh yes, I like that, I'm going to accept that. But we haven't actually experienced an immortal self. And in fact, it's impossible to experience an immortal self. So we can't say an immortal self exists, an immortal self does not exist completely. What we can say is that question is completely not relevant at all. It's actually impossible to hold these views based off what we see or hear or think or sense or know with our mind. None of that is sufficient to end up holding a view of this nature. And don't worry if it's a little bit confusing. We can also go to questions, but I just want to plant the seeds of these ideas so that you can reflect on them. Here's a list that the Buddha gives of ways that we can arrive at views which are faulty, but I think for now I won't go through it just because it will take a little bit too much time. But this is one of the famous suttas in the modern world now, the Kesamutti Sutta, sometimes known as the Kalama Sutta. And the Buddha says not to rely for our views or what we take as true. We can't rely on oral transmission or lineage or testament or canonical authority. We can't rely on logic or inference or reasoning through thinking, or reflecting on a view and then accepting it, or the appearance of a very competent teacher, or just out of respect for a teacher. None of those are enough to hold a view. What we really need to do to come to understand the truth is we need to understand dependent arising, especially contact, and how our experience arises, right? We need to understand the scope of our experience, how our experience arises, how it ceases, and the way to its ceasing. Or we can say how suffering arises, how suffering ceases, and the way to the cessation of suffering. That's what we can talk about. That is what the Buddha does declare, right? The other views which go beyond that, he doesn't declare those, because all of those are beyond, we could say, our reality, right? Beyond our world. So here are just some examples of this. The Buddha says, mendicant ought not rely on what's seen, heard, thought, or on precepts and vows, nor would they form a view about the world through a notion or through precepts and vows. For them, not even the tiniest idea is formulated here regarding what is seen, heard, or thought. That Brahman does not grasp any view. How could anyone in this world judge them? And also the removal of desire and passion for what is seen, heard, thought, or known here, for anything liked or disliked, is Nibbana, the imperishable state. So the Buddha is saying that Nibbana is the removing of desire and passion for all of our experience. Everything that we might see or hear or think or sense or know, all of that, we just remove desire for it, right? We don't try to step outside of it into speculation about the external world or a self or the soul in the body or substances or essences or gods, creator gods, right? Like eternal gods. We don't step outside of our experience to try to speculate on these things. We focus on our experience and we remove desire for it. That's what the core Buddhist practice comes down to. We have some more examples here of not getting involved in formulating or calculating views. And then we can maybe close. I have a few more here. So this is about the end. I think I'll close with these on talking about someone who does not get stuck in worrying about these positions. So someone asks the Buddha, what is the cause? What is the reason why a learned noble disciple has no doubts regarding the undeclared points? So they don't doubt, for example, whether the cosmos is eternal or not eternal. Why does the Buddha not say that? They don't get like the monk from before, Malukya, and get frustrated and think about it. And they don't doubt, maybe the answer, we just can't know the answer. Maybe I don't know the answer. It's that the answer is actually nonsensical. It actually extrapolates beyond reality, we could say, of what we experience. And so the Buddha says it's due to the cessation of views that a learned noble disciple has no doubts regarding the undeclared points, such as a realized one exists after death. This is a misconception, right? It's a misconception that the Buddha exists after death. It's a misconception that he doesn't exist, that he both exists and doesn't exist, or neither. They understand views, their origin, their cessation, and the practice that leads to their cessation. And so their views cease. They're freed from rebirth, old age, and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress. They're freed from suffering, I say. So this is really talking about an arahant, right? The arahanta has to let go of all views. They see, as we read before, they see the nature of everything that they experience, and they don't get stuck in it, grasp it, desire it, or formulate views about it. They understand its arising and ceasing, and so they don't get caught in these kinds of speculations and attachments. And so this is a passage which I won't read in detail, but it says that all of these views, for example, of speculation and the views in the Brahmajala Sutta, they all arise because of Sakkaya Ditthi. And this is related to the noble one or the learned noble disciple and the arahant. Sometimes when you hear about Sakkaya Ditthi, people will say it's just about believing in a self, right? But they don't tell you that, for example, this sutta here says someone who does not have Sakkaya Ditthi, they won't think that the world is eternal or not eternal or finite or not finite, or that the Buddha exists or doesn't exist or both or neither after death. None of those views will arise for them. So it's not just not believing in a self or something like that. It's actually understanding the nature of dependent origination, the nature of arising and ceasing, and moving beyond wrong views of existence or eternalism, non-existence, annihilationism, things being eternal, things being finite or infinite objectively, or substances like the soul and the body being separate substances or the same substance. All of those views are let go of, according to this, right, with the ending of Sakkaya Ditthi. And so Sakkaya Ditthi, we have to reflect deeper than just thinking about a self or no self. It's actually related to something more profound, right, about the arising and ceasing of our experience. And so this is an example of that. Anathapindika, who is a very learned and noble disciple of the Buddha, he was a householder. So this is also relevant to lay people, not just monastics, right? And Anathapindika says that his view, instead of all the undeclared points, which these other ascetics and philosophers held at the time, Anathapindika says his view is anything that is created, conditioned, chosen, independently originated is impermanent. And what's impermanent is suffering, and what's suffering is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. That is my view, sirs. So this is Anathapindika's view. This is the view that replaces all the speculative views I mentioned before, right? And we've talked about this a little bit. So whatever is created, conditioned, dependently originated, we try to understand how it arises and how it ceases, and we see its impermanence. And we see that the suffering, the unsatisfactoriness, the undesirability in that situation to let go of desire for it. And we see that it's not something that we can grasp at and appropriate as me, myself, or mine. This is the view of Buddhist practice, which leads to letting go of views. And so here we go back to the same topic, right? The Buddha says, when you think something up, you should think, this is suffering, this is the origin of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, and this is the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering, because those thoughts are beneficial and relevant to the fundamentals of the spiritual life. They lead to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and nibbana. And I think for the sake of time, I'll have to stop around there. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask. I know that I didn't get a lot of time to analyze the kind of logic of the undeclared points, but we did talk a little bit about it and why they arise. So if you have any clarifications you'd like to know, or any questions about this in practice, feel free to ask. So thank you again to Buddhist speaker for inviting me to speak.
Thank you so much, Venerable Sāmaṇera Vaḍḍhā, for this wonderful session. And we do have some questions. So, first of all, I think it will be also useful. What you said here was a very profound topic. I know a lot of people have some questions, especially regarding why Buddha was so quiet in certain cases, right? They always want answers. Sometimes, like, you don't even know, we don't know, and they want answers, and they want proof. So it's hard to prove certain things, you know. Okay, so let me post some questions. Let's see what Nikhil has. So how so we all sentient beings explores and makes dichotomy in samadhi, harmonious perspective view, and I think he's written michaditi. It should be michaditi, conflicting perspective view, consciously or unconsciously. So it's about the samadhi and michaditi.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Bhante. Yeah, well, we have sometimes we divide samadhi and michaditi into two categories, right? One we call the lokya, so this is belief like that there is karma, there is rebirth, there is the result of our karma, so our karma has results in future lives, and that there are beings who have realized the reality of this, that it's not just a speculation. So that's what we call samadhi, just on a very basic scale, like lokya. So it has to do with the world of rebirth and karma and so forth. And so that is a very strong dichotomy. The Buddha said that michaditi, believing there is no rebirth, there is no afterlife, denying that completely, denying that anybody knows that. The Buddha says that is michaditi. And then we have the other form of samadhi, which is the view of the Four Noble Truths. And that's what related to what we've been talking about today, right? So this is the view where in this, we already assume that rebirth exists, right, in the Four Noble Truths, right? So that's already assumed because craving leads to rebirth. So in the Four Noble Truths, we have to already have the first right view. If we don't believe in rebirth, then the Four Noble Truths don't make much sense, because then craving won't lead to rebirth. So with samadhi in the other end, this is how we let go of all speculative views. Instead of speculating about eternalism or annihilationism, or speculating about the world and the cosmos and the self, we just focus on the Four Noble Truths. And that's the view that will guide our path towards the end of suffering, instead of just getting stuck in the world and having opinions. So michaditi would be holding one of these views, for example, and sticking to it, right? Holding, the soul and the body are the same thing, and this is true. Everything else is wrong. That would be example of wrong view instead of the Four Noble Truths.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I think the sutta that you mentioned before, so Kachanagutta Sutta, also talks about the two extreme views, right? So the Buddha preached the Dhamma by the middle without going to either extreme. So Sabbangati, Ayang Ekowanto, and Sabbangati, another end. One is everything exists, the other is nothing exists. So both of them are extremes. So samadhi also can be, without going to either extreme. And also, I think in that sutta, the Buddha talks about the um, dependent origination, right? Yeah, that also can be helpful. Um, yeah, I'll also share the link later on the Kachana Gutta Sutta for you to read. And so Nikhil Shende has another question, Donovan. What is the correlation between perception and perception in our daily life with our different kinds of perspective views um, dealing with suffering, actually.
I'm not too sure what they might mean, Bante.
Yeah, so perception and conception. Oh, between perception and conception in our daily life. Nikhil, maybe you can remodel the question and please ask us later, okay? If you can remodel the question, that will be uh, all right. We have another question from Sud. No, oops, sorry. Okay, yeah. So, what is the right view to possess while one is practicing, as stated based on this sutta?
Yeah, so this, I think we covered this a little bit with the last question, but this would be the view of the Four Noble Truths, right? And like I said, that would include, or we kind of have to start with right view in terms of not denying rebirth and karma and so forth, right? It's important not to deny that, because then we would be denying an aspect of the Four Noble Truths, which is really the core of it. And so the right view would be setting aside speculation about existence and non-existence. So thinking, for example, that the Buddha exists or doesn't exist, or both or neither after death, or that we exist or don't exist, or both or neither. All of those views would be speculating beyond the Four Noble Truths. So instead, we just focus on dependent arising, and the Four Noble Truths are actually the same as dependent arising. They're just a shorter form. So if the 12 links seems like too much to you, it's okay. You can just focus on the Four Noble Truths, and that's the right view. So you focus, okay, what is this experience happening right now? What is the arising of the suffering? How does the suffering cease? And what is the path I need to practice to get there? So just focusing on the on the Four Noble Truths, and focusing on letting go of speculations beyond the frameworks that the Buddha gives. For example, we talk about the six senses and the five aggregates. When the different disciples of the Buddha, they explain the undeclared points to people, they ask him, why doesn't the Buddha declare it? We didn't get to talk about it today, but they say that the five aggregates and the six senses, it basically comes from not understanding the scopes and the limits of these things. So with the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth is, say, the Panchupadana Khandha, or the Salayatana, right? All of these things, just focus on understanding your experience and understanding how suffering arises and suffering ceases. And then that's the perspective that we need. And anytime you find yourself thinking like, um, do I exist? Do I not exist? Will I exist? Will I not exist? Right? And for example, the Sabbasava Sutta, the Buddha says all of that is ayoniso manasika. It's unhelpful attention. Just focus on the Four Noble Truths instead, and that should lead you in the right way. That's the view that will lead you towards understanding these views.
Okay. Bhavani has another question. It's very difficult to do karma unattached or without getting involved. Unbelievable. How to do karma unattachedly, Bante? I think, uh, yeah, without attachment. How to do karma?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'd say, we can't expect too much. We'll always have some attachment until we're enlightened, right? So don't stop doing good karma if you're attached. It's still okay to do good karma. Don't try not to do any bad karma and do good karma. And then you can just think, for example, I'm not going to do this for myself. I'm going to recognize the goodness in this for others and for the whole world. And I'll just do this because it's good, not because I want the results, right? We don't need to think like, I will do this because I'm going to get a good rebirth. We can just think, I'll do this just because it's great. It makes people happy. It makes less suffering in the world. And so focus your mind. You can kind of redirect your mind away from your selfish intentions, like I want the good results, and just focus your mind towards the happiness for everybody, not just for you, right? That good karma is good for everybody. It's good for the whole world. And it lessens hatred in the world. It lessens aversion and greed and fighting. And the world becomes more beautiful when we do good karma. So it's not just about us, right? It's about everybody. So I think that can help with attachment, right? Less selfish, but it's difficult, so don't expect too much.
And also, like, as we all live in this world, we also how to live. um, because we need to remember there are two things. One is the absolute truth, the other is the mundane truth. So even the arahants, they have to live. They have to eat food to live, right? They have to sleep. They have to also take medicine if they get sick. uh, Although they have, been enlightened, they still have to do it. And also remember, the Buddha even had compassion to go back to the family, and he helped them. And he was also thinking of his relatives. He was even tried to avoid the war between the Shakyans and what do you call Kolya. So how he was compassionate. So like uh, definitely they don't do any karma, but we do karma. If we have not attained the final liberation, we will all do karma. But during this life or during this samsara, we need to slowly find a way out of this attachment, because the attachment eventually will be the problem, right? Yeah, so we have to get rid of it, but then we have to use these limited resources to come out of this samsara. So don't stop hating or something yourself or hating others. You can do it. You have to first have compassion, loving kindness towards yourself, and also send loving kindness to others. And that way, eventually, you'll be able to get rid of all attachment, and also practice generosity. When you practice generosity, you will also be able to slowly and steadily get rid of all the attachments that you have. Yeah, I hope this can also help a little bit. Alisa, I think I can try to keep in mind to observe my mind when I can catch myself wanting to know. Maybe that's a good step in the right direction of this teaching.
Yeah, I think that that is right. Yeah, it's good to, if you notice like the mind kind of going towards that speculation, right, and trying to think about it, right, wanting to know, craving to know the answer. It's really good to say, oh, okay, this the Buddha said this is not helpful. Let me just catch that and redirect my mind, right? And this is the good thing that the Buddha, like in the last discourse I read, or one of the last, right? The Buddha promises that people who uh, for he doesn't have any doubts. He doesn't have that craving to know the answer, right? Because for him, all the answers are incorrect. So if you just keep practicing, right, don't get stuck. Catch your mind and bring yourself back. If you follow the right path, eventually you won't want to know anymore because you'll realize that they're all incorrect. They're all wrong, right? So yeah, I think that's very good. But it can also be good sometimes. The reason I want to talk about it is sometimes it can be good too to think, like, try to see why is it wrong to think about these things, right? Because if we don't think about it, but we think maybe one of them is right, then it might be hard to let go. But if you think, okay, why is thinking about that wrong? If I think about that, I'm actually going to be moving away from the Four Noble Truths. Then you can start to lose that attachment to wanting to know, even before you realize. So it's also good to reflect on why the Buddha didn't give an answer.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful answer, Brahma. And we have Julie commenting. Sotti Bhante Sunita. Thank you for having this wonderful Bhante for today's Dhamma talk. Oh, you already have appreciation. Thank you, Sāmaṇera Vaḍḍhā, for this wonderful teaching.
Oh,
Okay.
very kind.
Manas, Manal Vyasmeta, Venerables, what is the difference between non-existence and having the goal of liberation? I understand non-existence is an undeclared point, but is it wrong view to understand that our efforts may ultimately lead to liberation?
Okay, yeah, this is it's a good point, right? So the difference between non-existence and having the goal of liberation, I think maybe what you're thinking is, right, the Buddha said that we end rebirth, but what is the difference between that and non-existence, right? And the it's a subtle point, and we it'll take. I recommend you reflecting on it and practicing it by reading the suttas, because it will be too much to try to describe in detail here. But the main thing to understand is that non-existence, it has to do with an idea of kind of some kind of substance or essence or self that we think is going to cease to exist, right? But the Buddha says that dependent origination, it's the middle way between things that cease to exist, right? What we call vibhava ditthi, or the view ucheda ditthi, the view of annihilation. So non-existence, it means like thinking that something will actually cease to exist. But for the Buddha, he doesn't talk about things that truly exist or truly don't exist. There's just certain things arise with certain conditions. And when the conditions are not there, those things don't arise. But it's not that anything is annihilated. And I'll give one example of this, is that imagine that you have water running through a spout. And when the water is running, and then you turn the spout and the water stops running, right? So the water is pouring and then it stops pouring. But the water was never annihilated, right? The conditions for the water to pour ceased. So the water didn't come out of the spout anymore. But the water did not cease to exist. It wasn't destroyed or annihilated, or it's not non-existent. It's just that no longer are the conditions present for water to arise. And if you change the conditions, water might arise again. So it's the same thing. So liberation, it's not non-existence. It's just that suffering has certain conditions, and when those conditions are gone, then we turn it off and suffering doesn't arise. But nothing is actually annihilated or destroyed. We can't say things are non-existent. So it's good to just try to focus on developing the peace and happiness of the path, and following this map of the Four Noble Truths, instead of trying to veer off again into believing, okay, maybe I'm going to stop existing or I'm going to continue existing. Instead, just focusing on the actual results themselves, not about existence or non-existence, but just, is suffering ceasing? Is suffering coming to an end? That's really what matters.
Yes, yes. So also think of like also the bhava ditti, vibhava ditti, they also, and bhava tanha, vibhava tanha, like they are also two different cravings that we have apart from kama tanha. So very important to get rid of all these extremes and be in the middle always. Always the middle way, middle path really can help us all the time. Yeah, thank you so much. And then Nikki Shende has another question here. What is the correlation between perception, vinyana, okay, and its conception, nama rupa,
Hmm.
giving a name to it in our daily life with our different kinds of perspective views, dealing with our suffering. Um, did you get the question?
I think maybe Bante. I can try to answer
He's
quick.
trying. He's trying to, translate. I know he
Hmm.
was trying it in Hindi before.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll try to answer maybe Bante also.
Vijnana and Namarupa. This is what he wants to know the difference or the correlation.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. This is a really big topic, so I do talk about it here, but just very briefly, I recommend you read. Maybe I'll recommend suttas for you. Just I recommend you read the Mahanidana Sutta, Digha Nikaya 15, and I also recommend you read the called the Nalakalapi Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya 12.67. And that also talks about Vijnana and Namarupa and how they relate. And it also talks about the undeclared points, actually. It says, are they created by oneself or another or both or neither? And it talks about conditionality. So I recommend those suttas. Maybe I can write those or we can have those for you. But yeah,
Mahanidana Sutta, Nalakalapa Sutta, and
I'm sorry, Bante?
Mahanidana Sutta, Nalakalapa Sutta, the other one.
Yeah, I think those are okay. I think those are good, Bante. Yeah, just those two. There are some others that talk about it as well, Nikhil, but those are good ones. Yeah, so the relationship between them, very briefly speaking, is that they both depend on each other, like two sheaves of reeds, we sometimes say, right? So without consciousness, then it's impossible for us to have a functioning, body and mental faculties and experience of the world. It's just not possible because we wouldn't be conscious. But without the experiences of consciousness, without our actual body and our mental faculties for making consciousness able to perceive things, then there would be no consciousness. How could we be conscious of something if there was nothing for consciousness to be grounded in, to be established in, right? So this is sometimes called like a whirlpool or two sheaves of reeds, where without one we can't have the other. So they're not the same thing, but they're also not completely different things either. They're actually dependent. Oh, Bante, I cannot hear you. I'm not sure if you're muted, maybe.
So the two sheets help each other, right? Also, it is used like the blind and the cripple.
Hmm.
When the blind man can see and the cripple can't walk, the blind can't see. So if they get together, the blind man can walk, so the
Hmm.
cripple can, climb, can be on the shoulders of the blind man, and he could show the way, and the blind man can walk. So when you are together, you can do a journey. That's how it happens with the Namarupa. Yeah, together they can go a long way. Nama and Rupa together. The Nama is and the mind and the consciousness, and the Rupa is the body. And when they are together, they go a long way in the sense.
Okay.
Okay. All right. I think with that, we would like to call it a day. And yeah, I think the topic itself has many wonderful issues, but I didn't want to deal with all of them, like the role of intellectual limitations, right? The purpose of evasive responses,
Hmm.
and implications of non commitment, and comparison with the Buddha's silence, and philosophical significance of non assertion, impacts on ethical and practical living, and cultural and historical context. And there can be so many issues, middle path and non assertion again, effect on spiritual development. So Buddha, why he was not so interested in giving, not answering some of those questions, because eventually Buddha knew they're not going to help. If there are beginning to the world, the samsara, or to the end of the world, he didn't want to talk about these things, because that will be an endless questions, and it will not help anyone to attain the nibbana. So his main purpose, fundamental purpose, was to achieve the nibbana, to help the disciples to attain the final liberation, and whatever was helpful for that, he was showing the path towards that. So we would like to invite our friends to go through these suttas, and I also um, sent some of those links of different suttas, including the final sutta that Venerable Vaddha mentioned, Upadana Sutta and Nalakalapa Sutta. They are all there in the uh, in the chat. So please take a look, and we will discuss more later on. And yes, thank you again. With that, we would like to conclude today's session. Really appreciate Venerable Vaddha's beautiful talk. It was a beautiful talk. Yeah, very helpful. I hope this can also enhance the samadhi right view of our audience. And we wish you also the long life and good health to continue your wonderful Dhamma journey, and also looking forward to seeing you again with another Dhamma talk like this. And I'd like to actually invite you to um, do a short blessing to our audience in Pali.
Okay, yes, Bhante. Should I share merit with the devas or
Yes, please.
anything? Okay. Okay. So feel free to close your eyes or listen to this chanting and rejoice in the merit of hearing the Dhamma, and invite all the other beings that may be seen or unseen in the area to rejoice with us. Akasatha cha bhummatha devanaga mahindika punyang tang anumoditva chirang rakhantu desanang. Akasatha cha bhummatha devanaga mahindika punyang tang anumoditva chirang rakhantu sasanang. Akasatha cha bhummatha devanaga mahindika punyang tang anumoditva chirang rakhantu mang parang. Imina punya kammena mame balasadmagamo satang samagamo hotu yavanimbana patiya.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, see you again next week with another Dhamma session like this. And please stay in touch with Dhamma USA to get some more Dhamma sharings like this. Have a
Thank you
wonderful
so much, Bhante.
day to all of you. Thank you, Ada.